Those who have watched Joel Osteen for 26 years sense that something is going on with him. It appeared in front of 16,000 people last year at Midshipman. He mentioned something that wasn't in his notes, stopped talking, and spent more time than usual staring out at the crowd. Because even when you do everything correctly, life may still hit you hard at times. The grin returned. They applauded. The cameras continued to record. However, the most genuine moment was when the producer dropped and the man beneath revealed his face. Joel Osteen hasn't performed live in more than 10 years. Because the empire is crumbling beneath that smile. Donations are declining. There is currently a shooting at his own church. The man who America once referred to as the happiest pastor seemed exhausted. How, then, did the world's most viewed preacher get here? It began as a hurricane in August of 2017. Houston was more severely damaged by Hurricane Harvey than it had been in decades. Over 100 individuals had died by the time the rain eventually stopped. The damage was approaching $125 billion, and a third of the fourth largest city in the United States was underwater. I'm sure you've seen the pictures. Babies are being handed hand to hand across flooded streets, and families are stranded on rooftops. People see their entire lives float away while perched atop overpasses. And in the center of it all, close to downtown, was Lakewood Church, which had 16,000 seats and was the largest indoor venue for miles around. It remained blocked for several days. That was not tolerated by the internet. Photos of dry streets and deserted parking lots surrounding the church began to circulate, and the hashtag #OpenLakewood began to trend globally. Lakewood continued to explain. The structure was inundated. They lacked personnel. They were awaiting the filling of other shelters. And none of those justifications were accepted by anyone. When Joel finally tweeted that the doors were open, the harm had already been done. The hurricane was no longer the focus of the narrative. It had to do with the church that refused to open. Then he exacerbated it. He stood in front of a group of individuals who had lost everything during his first sermon following the storm and urged them to abandon what he referred to as their poor old mentality. The words fell precisely where you would have expected them to. Sleeping in shelters, people didn't want to hear about a victim mentality from a pastor whose mansion had been completely dry during the whole ordeal. Something broke at that point. It was trust, not the building. Then 2020 arrived, and the pandemic followed. The federal government launched the Paycheck Protection Program in an attempt to save small businesses that were failing all throughout the country. The people who might otherwise lose everything received emergency funds. With a multi-millionaire pastor at the top of a $90 million annual budget, Lakewood Church stealthily embezzled $4.4 million of it. And the backlash came quickly. The optics were already set, even though the church subsequently refunded the money. Now, they had witnessed Lakewood in two entirely different contexts, when regular people were in need of assistance and when money was on the table. Then there was the actual wealth. The 17,000 square foot mansion in River Oaks is worth $10.5 million, with an additional property worth about $3 million. While the first one was still being criticized, he purchased the second one. He came to the same conclusion each time someone questioned him about it. God desires for his children to be rewarded rather than burdened. That was faith to his supporters. It sounded to his detractors like a line he had been practicing for 20 years. However, it was a completely different statistic that truly lingered in every discussion regarding Lakewood. The church's yearly budget was reportedly allocated to outreach or charity to the tune of about 100%. Tens of millions of dollars annually for the remaining 99%. Roughly 1% of the church's yearly budget was reportedly allocated to charity or outreach. Tens of millions of dollars were spent annually on administration, weekly services, and media production, with the remaining 99%. The crazy thing is that this trend simply continued happening. In fact, Lakewood reacted quickly during Hurricane Beryl's 2024 devastation of Houston. Food and drink were distributed fairly instantly, but it made little difference. Since 2017, people have been asking the same question online. Why does it always require a storm to open those doors? Harvey's optics weren't only poor publicity. Once the public determines what your delay entails, they become irreversible. It cannot be reversed with a quicker response the next time. A public figure can be destroyed more quickly by a particular type of silence than by any scandal. It's the quiet that occurs between when the world begs for something and when you eventually provide it. Joel was an expert at smiling. The timing was something he had never truly mastered. The public first became aware of the smile's inherent delay during Hurricane Harvey. They were unable to stop noticing the delay once they noticed it. However, none of it, not the disaster, not the loans, not the mansion, prepared anyone for what entered Lakewood Church in February 2024. A lady called Jenice Yvonne Moreno entered Lakewood with an AR-15. Her 7-year-old kid accompanied her. Within minutes of her telling them she had a bomb, shooting could be heard reverberating through passageways designed to make people feel protected. A man, 47, was shot. Police fired back. In the exchange, Marina was killed, and her son, who had no say in all of this, was struck in the head. Despite having several surgeries, he managed to survive. However, his life would never be the same as it was prior to that Sunday. Later, investigators discovered that Marina had a lengthy history of mental illness, that she had previously made threats that were documented, and that she had lawfully purchased a weapon. There were cautions all around. None of them had been taken into action. The ensuing investigation took over a year to complete. They discovered security flaws and unheeded warnings. A system wholly unprepared for the events of that day. And in the months that followed, even longtime members of the church began posing more challenging queries than ever before regarding responsibility and leadership. Joel spoke to his church the next Sunday. He spoke in the same tone. It was always the case. Steady, calm, and comfortable. He offered up prayers for the victims. He prayed for the family of the shooter. He prayed for tranquility. After that, he went on. Nothing about what had gone wrong was mentioned. There is no consideration of the security holes. The true meaning of a child being shot within a sanctuary is not really acknowledged. Just have hope. Only the message. Calm didn't read as strength for the first time in his career. It said detachment. This is something worthwhile to sit with. What people think occurs inside a church, rather than what actually occurs there, is what makes it a sanctuary. Even while every brick remains in place, the building alters the instant that belief is shattered. In addition to harming Lakewood, February 11, 2024 changed the meaning of Lakewood. Furthermore, nothing like that can be rewritten twice in a sermon. From then on, the fissures got deeper. Already, younger generations had started drifting. According to recent surveys, church attendance among Gen Z and millennials is at its lowest point in American history. Approximately 15 to 16% of people routinely attend. What their parents want was not what they desired. Pastors who discussed injustice, war, the economics, and the violence in Lakewood itself were what they desired. Joel continued to discuss optimism. The gap turned into a silent problem unto itself. Something moved backstage as insiders began to speak. The energy had changed. There was an increase in volunteer turnover. Quiet cuts had occurred. People in the room reported that the applause inside the building no longer felt the same, even though it still sounded the same on television. This leads us to the portion of the narrative that is rarely discussed. Because you need to know who Joel Osteen was before any of you ever heard his name in order to comprehend why he responds to everything in the same way, whether it's a hurricane, a pandemic, or a shooting. This is a Joel Osteen fact that very few people are aware of. His sole responsibility at Lakewood Church for 17 years before taking the stage as a preacher was managing the cameras. His father, John Osteen, served as the preacher for 17 years. Joel was the young person in the production booth who was fixated on every shot's timing, lighting, angles, and sound mix. Joel consistently declined his father's requests to take the stage and preach. Making Dad seem nice on TV was his only goal. Consider how bizarre that is. 5 of the preacher's 6 children instinctively gravitated toward the pulpit, the choir, the singing, and the public speaking. Only Joel didn't. He headed in the other direction. He spent nearly 20 years hiding behind the camera. He only ever went in front of one when his father begged him to one Sunday. 6 days later, he passed away from a heart attack that no one anticipated. Take a moment to consider that. Joel Osteen's father's final memory was his first sermon. And the camera operator turned into the pastor overnight. Now consider the true meaning of that. Joel had never attended a preacher's training session. Not one. He had trained to make a preacher look nice on video for 17 years. Thus, he wasn't sharing the gospel when he took the stage in 1999. The only thing he truly knew how to do was what he was doing. He was in charge of a production. And everything about the next 26 years begins to make sense once you see it. The sermons that consistently last 30 minutes instead of an hour. The lighting is constant. The unbreakable smile. The message is consistently upbeat, optimistic, and, this is crucial, televisable. Joel did not construct a church that was featured on television. He created a television program that claimed to be a church. His message lacks fire because of this. No harsh words about sin, no brimstone. For a broadcast intended to reach 10 million American living rooms each week, none of that makes sense. Take a look at the actual church. The Houston Rockets' former basketball arena, the old Compaq Center, was leased for 30 years by Lakewood in 2003. The lease was $12 million. Renovations will cost an additional $95 million. Classrooms, broadcast studios, and floors were added. There wasn't actually a congregation inside the facility when it opened in July of 2005. The audience was in a studio. Millions more watched the show that evening, with 16,000 people in attendance. And that's the action that reveals everything. A basketball arena cannot be transformed into a sanctuary by a conventional preacher. A manufacturer does. A producer envisions a permanent set with flawless sightlines, excellent acoustics, and built-in camera placements. 92% of American households were watching his show by 2010. More than 4 million copies of Your Best Life Now were sold. Madison Square Garden was sold out 7 times during the Night of Hope tour. He was packing London's Wembley Arena. His personal wealth surpassed $50 million, and other estimates place it much over $100 million. The formula performed better than anyone could have predicted in a nation that was in dire need of positive news. The issue with maintaining a television program for 26 years is as follows. Life eventually offers the world an excuse to desire something other than positive news. The individual on the show must then determine whether or not to alter the script. Joel Osteen was never able to alter the script. Which takes us all the way back to the opening moment. That pause in the sermon last year. His notes did not contain the line. The smile that briefly wavered before returning to its original position. The cheers returned. The cameras continued to record. However, some closest to him claimed that day's actual sermon was the pause. Because the man's face was visible for a brief moment when the producer slid. This is the trap that no one discusses. A brand that strives for perfection cannot endure acknowledging flaws. The system beneath Joel Osteen would crumble if he stood up next Sunday and acknowledged genuine uncertainty, genuine anxiety, and genuine questions. The preservation of the smile is essential to the donations, book sales, and overall identity. That smile is no longer a barrier. It's a cage. In times like these, some pastors have attempted to redefine themselves. They tend to be vulnerable. They make admissions. At last, they allowed the audience to perceive them as human. But at this time, Joel Osteen finds it nearly impossible to make that step. Being unbroken is the foundation of his entire personality. The brand is the grin. There will be no brand left to rely on if the grin is taken away. Additionally, he was always in control of his tone, words, and appearance. However, control comes at a price. Joel said very little when racial rioting ripped through American communities. He remained silent as hostilities broke out. He didn't say anything real, political, or pointed when the economy devastated his own followers. He refers to it as spiritual focus. Critics refer to it as cowardice. Most likely, the reality lies somewhere in the middle. However, in 2026, remaining silent on something that genuinely harms people is no longer interpreted as neutrality. It appears to be absent. When you combine all of this, the 17 years spent behind the camera and the 26 years spent in front of it, you are essentially looking at a man who has spent nearly his whole adult life producing the same program. His father was the star at first, and later it was him. The screenplay, the set, and the smile are all the same. There has been some change in the lighting. The end result was always hope. The actor was always the pastor. Furthermore, the well-known, indestructible smile has nothing to do with faith. It had to do with ideal lighting. 26 years later, he is still doing what he learned on day one. The camera finally turned on him, and that's the only difference. Nothing has been written about whether Lakewood lives, whether his son inherits the empire, or whether the message can outlive the man. The books continue to sell, and the home continues to shine. Joel Osteen continues to stand at the pulpit every Sunday, telling everyone that their finest days are still ahead of them. He might even accept it. He might have to. For the first time in his whole ministry, however, the guy who founded a church by assuring people that everything would be alright appears to be aware that the outcome could not be what he has been promising. And perhaps it is the most lonely aspect of the entire narrative because there is a man someplace beneath the lighting, the brand, and everything associated with the church. There must be. Simply put, we haven't seen him in 26.